morning. It's March 19th here in Seoul, and I'm Peunji. We begin with these stories making the headlines at this hour, starting with the ongoing standoff between doctors and the South Korean government. Two senior doctors have received the final notice of license suspension from the government. This marks the first formal suspension of a license since the mass walkout by doctors. The second day of the Summit for Democracy, hosted by South Korea, is set to kick off later in the day here in Seoul. Today's events are mainly focused on the younger generation to guide them to understand the value of democracy better. After Russian President Vladimir Putin claimed his fifth term as the country's leader, he hailed the return of Crimea to Russia. But Putin's re-election was strongly condemned by the international community. Two senior doctors in South Korea have been sent their final notice of license suspension over their support for the junior doctors' walkout. Those doctors said they're set to take legal action against their suspension. Our Park Gun-woo starts us off.
The Health Ministry sent on Monday the first notifications of license suspension to two senior doctors. Those doctors, Bang Myung-ha and Kim Tae-gu, who are both leaders of an emergency committee at the Korea Medical Association, were given final suspension notices of 3 months, running from April 15th to July 14th. The ministry said Park and Kim were given the suspensions as they have been supporting the walkout of junior doctors. Park says the walkout was a result of voluntary action by trainee doctors individually and that he will take legal action. Trainee doctors are also preparing to take legal action as they will also start receiving suspension notices from next Monday. Over 2,000 male medical school students who have been on a leave of absence as a protest against plans for expanding the medical school admission quota have, according to a recent survey, shown willingness to join the military as a regular enlisted soldier rather than as a medical officer or public health doctor. The survey was conducted by the Korea Association of Medical Colleges, with around 5,000 students responding. Around 400 of those students were reported to already have applied for enlistment, which is in contrast to only 200 medical school students enlisted as a serving soldier 2 years ago. And medical school professors from universities including Seoul National University and Yonsei University are set to submit their resignations next Monday. Park Gun-woo, Arirang News.
The second day of the Summit for Democracy kicked off here in Seoul on Tuesday. Dozens of events are aimed at civil society and especially young people to guide them to understand the value of democracy better. Around 60 workshops hosted by experts and government officials from around the world are being held in Seoul's COEX. The events have varying themes including global democracy coalitions, politics, youth empowerment, and digital technology, among others. The second day is widely targeted at the younger generation to get them more interested in democracy, as part of the summit's goal is to actively include their voices and ensure they develop the vision of democracy. The visiting U.S. State Secretary Antony Blinken was quick to condemn North Korea's latest round of missile launch and reaffirm America's commitment as he met South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol and Foreign Minister Cho Tae-yul in Seoul. Our Kim Jung-sil has more.
A scheduled luncheon meeting between the top diplomats of Seoul and Washington came amid yet another provocative act by Pyongyang on Monday morning. Foreign Minister Cho and his U.S. counterpart, Secretary Blinken, condemned North Korea's launches of what appeared to be multiple short-range ballistic missiles ahead of the third Summit for Democracy taking place in Seoul. Seoul's foreign ministry released a statement saying that the top diplomats agreed that Pyongyang's continued threats would only enhance cooperation between South Korea, the U.S., and Japan, as well as the international community against the North. It added Secretary Blinken reaffirmed America's unwavering defense commitment to the security of South Korea. Minister Cho said even though the North has defined inter-Korean relations as those between hostile enemy states and announced that it will no longer seek reunification with the South, Seoul will continue to aim for reunification that extends freedom and basic human rights to all. This is the third time that the top diplomats of the allies have met in just a month. Before his talks with the foreign minister, the Secretary of State had a brief meeting with President Yoon Suk-yeol. There, Mr. Blinken said the U.S. will always stand with South Korea for a firm response to North Korean provocations and for peace and stability on the Korean peninsula by continuing to strengthen extended deterrence through close cooperation. Kim Jung-sil, Arirang News.
And along with world leaders, Blinken joins President Yoon in countering digital threats to democracy. The third Summit for Democracy kicked off in Seoul, independently hosted for the first time outside the United States. Our presidential office correspondent Oh Soo-young has the details.
South Korea, the United States and the United Kingdom have called for solidarity in defending democracy for future generations amid fast-evolving digital changes that threaten freedom, human rights and prosperity. This came at the opening ceremony of the Third Summit for Democracy, which kicked off in Seoul on Monday, gathering world leaders, civil society and the private sector under the theme of democracy for the future generation. In his speech, President Yoon Suk-yeol said artificial intelligence and new digital tools pose a double-edged sword to societies and individuals, citing fake news and disinformation as major threats. He also warned against a growing digital divide between nations that would widen economic gaps and, in turn, increase the democracy divide. He called for efforts to ensure digital progress goes hand in hand with democracy.
개인의 자유와 창의를 북돋우는 활기찬 민주주의는 청년들의 역량과 기회를 확장하는 촉진제가 될 것이며 이를 통해 우리의 미래 세대는 민주주의에 대해 더욱 확고한 믿음을 갖게 될 것입니다.
This year's summit begins with a ministerial-level meeting co-hosted by the UK and Ecuador, followed by an expert roundtable to address cyber threats while fostering digital innovation in a way that respects human rights and freedom in online spaces. Deeming South Korea a champion of democracy, US Secretary of State Antony Blinken remarked on the significance of the country hosting the summit independently for the first time outside the United States. The Summit for Democracy was first launched in 2021 under the leadership of US President Joe Biden amid the worrying rise of autocratic leaders and authoritarian governance around the world. Blinken called for collective efforts for democratic renewal to sustain faith in democracy.
In many places, basic freedoms have eroded. Electoral rights have come under assault. Corruption has eaten away at hope. As authoritarian and repressive regimes deploy technologies to undermine democracy and human rights, we need to ensure that technology sustains and supports democratic values and norms.
UK Deputy Prime Minister Oliver Dowding called for a full-spectrum response to a full spectrum of threats.
Increased cyber defences, tackling mis- and disinformation, protections for candidates at home, and global consensus abroad. We will not be afraid to call out this malign activity wherever we see it.
The plenary session of world leaders will be held virtually on Wednesday evening's Seoul time, with President Yoon chairing the talk on technology, elections and fake news. Kenyan President William Ruto will lead a session on the Global South, and Danish leader Mette Frederiksen on inclusive society and youth empowerment. Oh Soo-young, Arirang News.
Like we just heard, the third Summit for Democracy, hosted by South Korea, is currently taking place here in Seoul. This is the first time that the U.S.-led initiative is being hosted by another country. For more on this, we're joined by Professor Kim Hyun-wook this morning. Welcome to the studio.
Thank you for having me.
So first of all, why is South Korea holding the Summit for Democracy, and why is this so significant?
Well, I think, South Korea has been always a country that is hesitant to contribute to international community. For a long time, South Korean diplomacy was only focused on the Korean Peninsula. But I think a very big change happened by the Yoon Suk-yeol government. Yoon Suk-yeol government's trying to make South Korea to become a global pivotal state, trying to make South Korea to contribute to more to regional community and global community. And I think in that sense, this is a very important critical juncture for South Korea to expand its diplomatic sphere, I think.
Right, and on the first day of the summit, North Korea fired ballistic missiles while Blinken was in Seoul. What's the intention behind this move by the regime?
I think North Korea has been, conducting a lot of military provocations last year and this year. But for some time, there was a Chinese political event and also Russian general election. So after all these allies events are finished, North Korea is again doing a lot of military provocations. The reason I think is that maybe Secretary Antony Blinken is visiting Seoul, so I think by shooting missiles, North Korea is trying to show to the United States that hey, North Korea is here, the Korean Peninsula, North Korea is here. It's not only the democracy that is important, but North Korea is important. So President Biden or any other president possible, maybe if Trump is reelected, should pay attention to North Korea. This is kind of a signal to the United States, I think.
And top diplomats of South Korea in the U.S., Cho Tae-yul and Antony Blinken, held a meeting over lunch yesterday. They've already met 3 times over the past month, and Blinken has now visited Seoul twice in the past 6 months. So what's your take on this?
Well, I think the U.S. and South Korea relationship is getting very close and close, right, at this time with Yoon Suk-yeol government coming in. This time, it's a very important signal that, 2 countries are all democratic states. Their value-based alliance is very important. And also, as you mentioned, North Korea is launching and shooting ballistic missiles. So maybe 2 countries and 2 secretaries meet together to talk about what to do about North Korea. Maybe U.S.-South Korea alliance and U.S.-South Korea, Japan trilateral cooperation is something that needed to do something about North Korea. And also, I think they agreed that North Korea policy is still a denuclearization. I mean, there are a lot of voices that North Korea is already a nuclear weapon possessing state, so we have to change our policy towards North Korea. But they reaffirm that their policy towards North Korea is still a denuclearization, complete denuclearization.
All right, Professor Kim, thank you so much for your insight this morning.
Thank you very much.
South Korea's defense ministry has unveiled its core tasks for the year with a prime focus on boosting defense capabilities against North Korea's evolving nuclear and missile threats. They include the launching of additional military reconnaissance satellites, as well as the deployment of a new ballistic missile. Our defense correspondent Choi Min-jung explains.
South Korea's defense ministry has announced 3 major tasks for this year to make the country a global pivotal state that embodies peace through strength. First, to boost the country's military, the ministry will prioritize strengthening response capabilities against North Korea's nuclear and missile threats. This will be done by advancing South Korea's space technology in the defense sector. Seoul successfully launched its first military reconnaissance satellite last December and plans to launch 2 more this year, one in April and another in November. The country will also deploy a newly developed homegrown tactical surface-to-surface missile which can precisely strike the regime's command facilities for the very first time this year. The ministry also aims to expand the scope of defense cooperation with countries that share the same values. Last year, South Korea and the U.S. established the Nuclear Consultative Group to strengthen extended deterrence against nuclear threats posed by the North. This year, the 2 sides will establish joint nuclear operation guidelines, conduct exercises and training that mimic the response to a North Korean nuclear attack, and expand the deployment of U.S. strategic assets on the peninsula. Lastly, the ministry plans to boost strategic defense capabilities through the K-defense industry. It explained that if South Korea's defense exports and production cooperation increase, a supply of Korean-made weapons and ammunition would be available from overseas. These could be utilized in times of emergency and would also generate economic growth. South Korea also said it will make efforts for the signing of the reciprocal defense procurement agreement between Seoul and Washington to help ease trade barriers for bilateral arms exports. Defense Minister Shin Won-sik said that the ministry will do its best to ensure that national defense also helps the nation's economy. Choi Min-dong, Arirang News.
North Korean leader Kim Jong-un on Monday oversaw firing drills involving super-large multiple rocket launchers. According to the North Korean Central News Agency on Tuesday, the regime's leader guided artillery firing drills in the country's western region, involving a 600mm multiple-launch rocket system. Kim was quoted on the report as saying that its military should more thoroughly fulfill their missions to block and suppress the possibility of war through its preparedness to destroy the capital of the enemy, apparently referring to Seoul. The report said that the North also conducted a test simulating a mid-air detonation of a super-large multiple rocket launcher at a preset altitude. The South Korean military on Monday detected multiple short-range ballistic missiles fired by the North from the Pyongyang area. Russian President Vladimir Putin on Monday held his first speech since his landslide presidential election victory. Marking the 10th anniversary of the annexation of Crimea, he called the occupied territory of Ukraine returned territory and vowed to move forward together. However, the elections received criticism from the international community, with some calling the result illegal. Our Lee Seung-jae has more.
In a landslide victory, Russian President Vladimir Putin won his fifth term in office. Taking over 87% of the votes, the election victory solidifies Putin's power even further, allowing him to stay in office until at least 2030. Marking the 10th anniversary of the annexation of Crimea, Putin delivered his first speech since his election victory, where he called the occupied territory of Ukraine returned territory. He also noted the 4 occupied territories of Ukraine that took part in the recent presidential elections.
Regarding Novorossiya and Donbass, people who lived there during the Russian spring expressed their will to return to their family as well. Their way to the homeland was much more grave and tragic, but in the end we did it. It is a big event in the history of our country.
However, the Russian presidential election was met with heavy condemnation by the international community. White House National Security Council spokesman John Kirby said given the fact that Putin has imprisoned his political opponents and prevented others from running against him, this election was clearly neither free nor fair. Josep Borrell, the European Union's High Representative for Foreign Affairs and Security, criticized the result, describing the election as being based on repression and intimidation. The German Foreign Ministry pointed out through its social media X that Russia's fake election was neither free nor fair. Most vocal was Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky, who slammed Russia for pretending to hold an election. There were also claims that the election was illegal, citing issues such as the fact that transparent ballot boxes were used and that voting was conducted in 4 occupied territories in Ukraine. China, India, and North Korea offered congratulations. Meanwhile, European Union foreign ministers on Monday agreed to impose sanctions on people and organizations responsible for the death of Russian opposition leader Alexei Navalny. Foreign Policy Chief Josep Borrell said that about 30 individuals and entities will be sanctioned. Lee Seung-jae, Arirang News.
Good morning. I'm Kim Si-young, and now we turn off to stories from around the world. US President Joe Biden, in a phone call with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu on Monday, warned against an Israeli military operation in Rafah, saying it would deepen the anarchy in Gaza. In a press briefing following that call, US National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan said that a major ground operation in Rafah would be a mistake, as it would lead to more innocent civilian deaths and worsen the already dire humanitarian crisis. The call came on the same day as the release of a United Nations food security report, which said about half of the population in Gaza is suffering from catastrophic hunger and starvation. The UN-backed Integrated Food Security Phase Classification report said that famine is now imminent in the Gaza governorates, defining famine as when at least 20% of the population suffer from extreme food shortages and there are deaths from starvation and malnutrition. UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres said the report was an appalling indictment of conditions on the ground for civilians. Following a report that SpaceX was building spy satellites for a US intelligence agency, Chinese state media on Sunday criticized the United States, saying that it is threatening global security. A social media account of the People's Liberation Army said that the SpaceX program reveals shamelessness and double standards of the US. According to a recent report by Reuters, SpaceX's Starshield is developing a satellite network under a $1.8 billion classified contract with the US National Reconnaissance Office. The NRO acknowledged that its mission is to develop space-based surveillance systems. A report in Chinese state-run newspaper, The Global Times, cited an expert who called the satellite project a challenge to global security and stability. Now to Haiti, where at least 12 bodies were discovered early Monday local time in an affluent neighborhood on the outskirts of the country's capital, Port-au-Prince. The victims had reportedly been shot earlier the same morning amid an uptick in criminal activity, including looting and theft of electrical equipment in wealthy areas of the city. Haiti's capital remains paralyzed following an outbreak of gang violence on February 29th and a political impasse following the resignation of the country's prime minister. In an effort to control the violence, the Haitian government announced on Sunday it would extend a nighttime curfew to March 20th. A new mural by acclaimed street artist Banksy appeared overnight on Sunday on a residential building in North London. The mural, which is painted on a wall sitting behind an old cherry tree, featured a life-size depiction of a woman holding a pressure washer as if she sprayed green paint on the wall on the block of flats. The green paint seemingly depicts leaves behind a tree which currently has no leaves of its own. James Peake, the creator of the Banksy story on BBC Radio 4, said that the art has a clear message that nature is struggling and it is up to us to help it grow back.
Good morning. It looks to be a windy, wet, and chilly early spring day. Right now, Chungcheongdo and Jeollabuk-do provinces are seeing some heavy rain, and these rain clouds will gradually expand to the rest of the country. And winter is still in full swing in mountainous regions in Gangwon-do, with up to 20 centimeters of snow in the forecast until tomorrow, or 30 millimeters of rain for the east of Gangwon-do. Meanwhile, nearby areas will also see 1 to 8 centimeters of snowfall. So a preliminary snow advisory has been issued in the region. Jeju and most of the coastal regions could be under a strong wind advisory today. Meanwhile, the capital area will see sprinkles during the first half of the day, and there might even be sunshine by mid-afternoon with an expected high of 11 degrees Celsius. Gwangju will be at 14 degrees with more sunshine than clouds. So afternoon temperatures will be 1 to 5 degrees lower than yesterday in most places. It will stay chillier than norms through Friday morning, with another band of rain in the forecast on Friday afternoon. That's Korea for you, and here's a look at the international weather conditions.
That wraps up today's New Day at Arirang. We'll bring you more updates at the same time tomorrow.